to let you know we're live on here. I had to get it started early so we can get it published.
We're live on the camera. Good to see you, Mr. Chairman.
Amen. Throw this stuff up here so you can.
All right.
Howdy.
Yeah, a word with you sometime.
Okay. Be here all day.
Nothing serious. Just what.
So Mike's live. Everything's live right now.
Everything's live. I'm trying to get it so we can get posted on the website so folks can tune in.
You're on live on Facebook, is that right, Tim?
Yes. Hey, good to see you.
Good. Hey, doing the thing.
It's all good.
Yeah, that's how you rolled in yesterday afternoon. Good. I don't think so. We talked about trying to get this changed. We haven't done that. Didn't seem like we had. Summer it is. That's right.
Yeah, the other one's with home. That's a landline. Did you have faith?
No, you're fine.
Last night I was with a 2-year-old Beetlejuice and a 4-year-old Werewolf. My daughter is the Beetlejuice. Sure. Bob? Kelly. Just another day. Bob? Bob, go. Yeah. We're going to start as soon as Tito gets here. Thank you. Good morning. We'll get underway. I'm still on the road coming down from Bellingham. I left at 4 this morning, so
I don't know if that's dedication or what, but I'm still humming. So welcome to the joint meeting between the Oregon and Washington commissions, and then we will be sliding into the Washington Fish and Wildlife Commission meeting tomorrow and Saturday. But today is a joint meeting, and it's a real pleasure to welcome our colleagues from across the river, and nice to see you. Hope the swim was good coming over.
Oh yeah, it's always good to see cousins.
So my name is Brad Smith, and I'm chair of the Washington Commission. I'm from Bellingham, and I will let my fellow commissioners introduce themselves.
Good morning. My name is Larry Carpenter. I'm the vice chair of our commission. I'm from Mount Vernon, Washington.
Good morning. My name is Bob Kehoe, and I am from Seattle.
Kim Thorburn, Spokane.
Dave Graybill, Leavenworth, Washington.
Barbara Baker. I'm from Olympia.
I'm Don McIsaac. I'm the newest member of the Washington Commission, and I'm the local guy from here in Clark County.
I'm Jay Holzmeller from Manatone, and that is as far south and as far east as you can go in the state, and met one of my neighbors this morning.
You have a neighbor?
Holly, she lives right across the canyon.
Good morning. My name is Michael Finley. I'm the chairman of the Oregon Fish and Wildlife Commission. We represent by statute our congressional districts 5, and then we have an at-large member, one for Eastern Oregon and one for Western Oregon. And I'm the chair and the Western Oregon designee.
Bob Weber, commissioner from Port Orford down on the south coast.
Holly Atkinson, commissioner from Enterprise, and I'm the other one that's on the far end of the state. I represent east of the Cascades.
I'm Greg Woolley. From Portland. I represent the Portland metro area, which is Congressional District 3 in our state.
I'm Bruce Buckmaster from Astoria, Congressional District number 1.
Jim Biddle, Central Point, Oregon, District number 2.
And we're missing one commissioner that we have an empty slot that has to still be nominated by the governor and approved by the state senate. But Brad, I want to say thank you for help hosting us and setting this up. I know that the staff tells me that it's been very easy, so now we're going to get to the hard part. Setup was easy.
Thanks. And we are also one commissioner short, and that we hope to be filled soon. There are 9 of us in the state of Washington. So on the call of order, opening remarks, it was brought to my attention a couple of commissioners wish to make a couple opening remarks. I'll open it up to anybody down here first. Yes, Commissioner McIsaac.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to say thanks in terms of opening remarks to all the people that have spawned this meeting and who have worked to make it happen over the course of the last several months. I know the seed that germinated this meeting happened before I was on here, but it's sure gratifying to see everybody here. I've got some high hopes that our joint discussion of issues of common interest will lead to the highest level of regulatory concurrency possible to achieve our mutual conservation and management goals.
That's good, yeah.
And in terms of maybe some opening remarks relative to the Washington policy that's been under comprehensive review for the last year, I agree with the 3 general purposes of the Washington policy: conservation, orderly fisheries, and enhancing the economic well-being and stability of Columbia River fisheries. We've done a very good job on conservation through the years, and I'm convinced that we can continue to do that. We've got an excellent biological staff. We've got some outstanding enforcement officers, and I'm sure that we can continue with orderly fisheries if we have concurrent regulations. If we don't have concurrent regulations, then things could get a little messy, I think, and disorderly. Regarding the goal of maintaining and enhancing fisheries, and the communities that depend on healthy fisheries, I think we can do a little better on that, and I think we'll hear from the staff a little bit more about that. I've always believed that the more people that are interested in salmon, the better off the salmon will be. And I believe if we can have strong sport, commercial, and tribal fisheries that are sustainable under our conservation goals, then we'll have more people from all sectors working hard to make sure that things get better for the salmon resources in the Columbia River. So I'm looking forward to working with my fellow commissioners from Oregon towards our getting some fully concurrent conservation and management policies in the future.
Thank you. Any opening remarks from the Oregon Commission? Seeing none?
Okay.
Then I would invite both directors. Director Sussman, did you have anything you wanted to kick us off with?
I think we've got a pretty full schedule, and so I'm glad to be here. This is my first joint meeting with the Oregon Commission and Oregon Agency. Glad to met Kurt this morning, so excited to work together. Otherwise, I'd say let's get into it.
Director Melcher.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would just reemphasize something that Commissioner McIsaac mentioned, and that is the great value that we've placed on concurrent regulations over the last better part of a century. And so I think our interests here are in working collaboratively with Washington in achieving these concurrent regulation packages, and also that we view this really as an opportunity to kind of reinitiate some relationship building between the two commissions. And we haven't had a joint meeting. I think it's been about 3 or 4 years, maybe even longer than that. And our statutes provide us with the flexibility to meet with other states and state commissions on issues of mutual interest. So really, really happy to do this here today, and happy to have the full participation from the commissions as well as the public is joining us here. So with that, I would be happy to move on through the agenda.
Thank you. Thank you all. Then we will go right into item number 2, which is Columbia River Fishery Management Policies. This is a briefing and a workshop. And Bill, I will turn it over to you. Your name was first on the list, Bill, so I don't know. Senior.
Commissioners and directors. My name is Bill Twite, and I'm a special assistant in the fish program of the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. This morning's presentation is as a two-state panel discussion, and so have the other panelists introduce themselves to you, and then we'll dive into the presentation if that's your pleasure at this point.
Good morning. I'm Ryan Lothrop. I'm the Columbia River Policy Coordinator. I work for Bill up in the Olympia office, but travel down to the Ridgefield area quite a bit for on a weekly basis.
Good morning. Chris Kern, Deputy Fish Division Administrator with the Columbia Marine Programs for ODFW.
Tucker Jones, Ocean Salmon and Columbia River Program Manager for the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. Little side anecdote, I just think it's interesting to note that about 20 years ago, coming up in December, I stood in this room as the best man for my best friend when he got married here. So,
are they still married?
Yeah. No.
Commissioner
Bad
Smith,
karma.
that was the wrong question.
Bad karma.
Never ask a question if you don't know the answer.
Or don't want to hear it.
So we have a multi-part discussion this morning, so I wanted to orient you to the different parts that we were going to cover, and we'll be switching around back and forth between staff. But I want to emphasize that overall the presentation has been a joint effort Even though we're on individual parts of it, this is something that, as is typical of all the technical work that we do, all the analytical work we do, products get shared back and forth across the river. The workload gets divvied up often, and we always have the chance to review and comment on each other's work. And much of our work is actually produced under joint letterhead. In this case, not all the parts are actually on sort of joint letterhead, but we've all had an opportunity to provide input on each other's work. So with that, Ryan, do you want to sort of walk us through exactly how the agenda is going to go?
Yes, so we're going to first start off with the timeline, so the review process between the two states' policies, which Oregon will walk us through that. Then I'll take over and walk through our Washington policies review for the last 5 years. This is a very similar presentation and information provided to the Washington Commission 2 weeks ago. And then we'll kick it back over to Oregon to walk us through concurrency and thermal sanctuaries, and then on to next steps.
Thanks, Ryan. So just in the packet, I believe everybody received, there's a document entitled Oregon-Washington Commission Review Timeline and Concurrency. Most of what I'm speaking to is on the first page. It was a little large to put in the PowerPoint, so that's why we provided a hard copy instead. That timeline just lays out the dates and activities of the two commissions for the last couple of years, particularly starting at the end of the transition period, which ended in 2016. And you'll see that both commissions began reviewing that transition period at that point, late 2016 as planned, and that there's a lot of similarities in those timelines from then on. Speaking of the Oregon side, we began the comprehensive review for the transition period in November of 2016 and had additional analyses and follow-up discussions at the commission in December, January, March of 2017. And based on that review, the Oregon Commission adopted some rule modifications in March of 2017, which remain in effect today. And as the commission guided staff, we've been providing annual updates every year, and so we continued that in March of 2018, summarizing 2017 fisheries. The Washington Commission also adopted some policy revisions in January of 2017, as I understand it, with some additional discussions in March. And those included the extension of the transition period approaches for the fall seasons for 2017 and 18, with a requirement for a comprehensive review at the end of 2018. And as Ryan mentioned, Washington staff have been conducting that review with check-ins with your commission and the public, and also presented that summary at October 15th. And that sort of brings us to today, November 1st, joint meeting, and that's what I had for the timeline to set it up and turn it over back to Ryan or Bill.
So I'll be walking through our 5-year, and by our I mean Washington, excuse me, Fish and Wildlife Commission policy review. So we've had quite a bit of staff dedicated to this review. We've worked alongside with Oregon and data requests and reviewing of any analyses they have to assist us with our process. So we'd like to say thanks on the support there and all the staff that's assisted Bill and myself along the way in reporting back to the commission and the public. So I'm going to walk through a brief background on this 5-year policy review, or what led up to the 5-year policy review. The timeline, so when it initiated, what got us to where we are today, the commission briefings that have occurred over the last essentially 8 to 9 months, and then the public outreach that we've incorporated into this policy review. And then really the nuts and bolts of this presentation will be actually reporting out on each of the major sections of the policy review. And then there'll be a summary and then on to next steps. So the Columbia River Fishery Management Work Group developed strategies in 2012, and the Washington policy adopted their policy in 2013, relying upon and dependent upon some of the work that occurred with the work group. It was amended in 2017 and is currently in effect through 2023. As mentioned from Commissioner McIsaac, there are 3 primary objectives: orderly fisheries, conservation and recovery of salmon and steelhead, the economic well-being of and stability of both the sport and commercial fisheries. There is recognition that information will change over time, and so we have adaptive management. And that the overarching principle behind this policy was to establish recreational priority for salmon and steelhead in the main stem. So I mentioned that this started about 8 or 9 months ago. It came from a request back in January in the form of 40 questions from the Fish and Wildlife Commission to determine how the 5-year review, how 5 years of the policy has performed. We've since then, through just last month, have had both commission presentations and fish committee briefings with the commissioners. In both cases, those meetings were open to the public, and we, had some added emphasis into some questions, some analyses that we've conducted, some feedback on our analysis, and to better produce this report. And we've also reached out with our both commercial and recreational Columbia River advisory groups that we co-manage with Oregon staff. And so we had those primarily in Ridgefield, but we also had one Eastside public meeting that we garnered some additional information from over in the Tri-Cities area. So during this entire process, we provided information on our both advisory group websites, as well as the commission website, and directed people to those sources as these draft versions of the review report were developed. So I mentioned we had 40 questions. Well, a lot of these questions had some similar themes, so we recategorized these into 7 overarching themes. You have management, recreation, commercial, tribal, allocation, alternative gear, and economics. As I walk through the rest of this presentation, which is the actual evaluation itself, you'll notice that we aren't listing out individual questions on this, more or less categorizing them into policy strategies. And some questions were, less significant for the success of the policy, so they may not be contained in here, but these are the large principles that we're reporting today on. And so looking at this, we also have SCORE up there as kind of a metric, and so you can swap that out with implemented. And looking at red, you can swap that out between meaning no or not implemented or did not occur. Yellow means mixed or partially implemented, and green would mean yes or implemented or did occur. So the first strategy was conservation. Before I jump into that, it's important to note that one of the purposes of the policy was to advance conservation recovery of salmon and steelhead, focusing on and promoting recovery of ESA populations, the agency leadership and recovery actions, including hydro and meeting the terms of USV Oregon. The policy has built-in conservation benefits based on the Columbia River Management Agreement and under USV Oregon and the associated biological opinion. In short, these conservation efforts that are ongoing outside the policy, we are meeting those objectives. However, the policy does have an added question regarding are we meeting objectives for PHOS, so proportional hatchery fish on the spawning grounds, and reducing those numbers, primarily on fall snook and coho. And so these were dependent upon increased mark selective fisheries. As you can see there, we have red category, so it's not been successful in the sense that these reductions did not occur as expected. There was an overall slight reduction in PHOS, but those are primarily attributed to weirs, removing hatchery fish. So moving on to mark selective fisheries, these occurred, and this was a little bit tied into the previous question. They occurred at low levels. It gets a red category there due to the low level of occurrence in the sense that they were infrequent or not powerful in sense of fully implemented mark selective fisheries. And the next strategy was predation. And similar to conservation, there's a lot of work ongoing outside of the policy itself, such as marine mammals and northern pike minnow reward program. WDFW authority on much of the predation, we do not have the authority. However, there is progress in some of those sectors, so it gets kind of a mixed category or yellow score. The next item is concurrency. Much of our allocations with Oregon are similar or identical. However, there are several situations where they are not the same. I won't get into too much details because we're going to bring that up after this presentation. For example, there are differences in the fall Chinook allocation between the commercial and sport fisheries. Staff also provided a synopsis, which is in your packet, of challenges that arise from not being concurrent, which can lead to challenges for staff in planning fisheries, harvesting available fish, and enforcing of regulations. The last item there, management tools. What that pertains to is using metrics or technology or other forms for staff to improve their ability to, for example, develop forecasts or manage their data sets or run reconstruction development. That's work that staff on both sides of the river are always striving to improve on. So that is ongoing, and we're always moving forward on that one. So moving forward into the recreational theme, we have 3 points here: recreational priority, barbless hooks, and logbooks. Recreational fisheries were prioritized across all fisheries during the pre-season planning process, and that is due to the allocation changes. Barbless hooks were implemented within most areas, and there are some exceptions where there are low ESA impacts in tributaries. And the last item there, logbooks. Washington does have the authority, and background on that one is collecting information from the guide industry on how many trips or what they're catching or encountering. And so that work, Washington does have the authority to enact that regulation for the guide industry. However, it has not occurred yet, and there are ongoing discussions on what that may look like, and I believe that's will be brought up later on today in discussion in more detail. So the commercial theme here, you have your MSC certifications. That's marketing for sustainable fisheries for the commercial industry. You also have buyback, increased Washington safe or select areas. And then another question is if we monitored the 2017 commercial fishery in the main stem. So with the MSC certification, this was not reviewed or pursued during the 5-year policy. Certification costs were expensive. However, it was reviewed back in 2008 to 2009 that led to those being aware of the high costs. There are other avenues to improve marketing that are probably cheaper, but we focused in on MSC certification on this analysis. And then buyback, essentially nothing has occurred. It has started, stopped, and has since then this year has restarted with stakeholders. So that's why it gets a red score. And then the new Washington safe areas. In Washington, we haven't had any success. We've pursued work in the Kathlamet Channel, had very low survival, have conducted test fisheries and has deemed not to be successful. There have been improvements on the Oregon side, however. And the last item there is monitoring the 2017 fishery in zones 4 and 5 for the commercial gillnet fishery. That did occur last year, and with similar results as expected. For example, the handle of steelhead was low and similar to what preseason expectations were. However, we did also know that Chinook harvest was less than expected. One thing I may have omitted when I started off is the This is a 5-year review, and so that would imply 2013 through 2017 are the years we were reviewing for this policy. So in some cases, we are looking back at pre-policy years, so that, just for background information, that's 2010 through 2012. So sorry, I forgot to mention that earlier today. So moving on to the tribal theme, we have the Colville allocation and Wanapum subsistence. Those of you who aren't familiar with those tribes, they are non-treaty tribes, not part of USV Oregon. We have state statute to provide opportunity for fishing with those tribes. And so in both cases, we're providing those with Colville's primarily for summer fisheries, and Wanapum has harvest opportunities for summer fall chinook, a little bit of spring chinook, and sockeye as well. And those are located interior Columbia River within the state of Washington. And then USV Oregon tribes, that was a question we actually did not receive from the commission, but because this is a tribal theme, we thought it was relevant to include USV Oregon tribes and show that we are meeting the allocation obligations that are in standing with the USV Oregon. So moving forward on to allocation, our Washington policy allocates ESA impacts. In reviewing whether the preseason impact proportions match the postseason impact proportion, is not always best to view that as success. Staff does show ESA allocation sharing in our full report. However, we're focused a little more on proportion of allocated catch. And so in this review, we're looking at between the sectors, commercial and sport, as well as geography between upriver and downriver. In-season management can have effects on how this plays out, when the run is updated, whether it's increased or decreased when fisheries occur. So that's just something to note. But overall, across all species, recreational and commercial fisheries harvest a high proportion of their allocation. So in a sense, we are meeting the obligation, what is prescribed in the policy for allocation. To note, with spring chinook, we use catch balance, and that is more constraining than the ESA impacts. Within the sport sector, we have approximately a 5-year average of 88% for sport attaining their share, and then commercial is 95%. Within sport, you can see it's a yellow category, and that's referring to above Bonneville. Below Bonneville, doing quite well and meeting a high majority of their catch balance, but above Bonneville between 1 and 6, so that's Oregon, Washington border downstream to Bonneville, and then the Snake River. Those are more variable on years based on run sizes, timing, water conditions. So on all average, though, they do use up a majority of their allocation, but it does vary quite a bit from year to year.
And when we've missed the allocation, at least in 1 year, we missed it big time, essentially granting almost no fishing time to the upriver. And so again, that's part of the reason why it's shown as yellow, is these aren't, as Ryan mentioned, these aren't, at least a couple of the years, they haven't been small misses, they've been big misses in terms of allocation.
Thanks, Bill. So with summer, between the sport and commercial, they both average about 84 to 85% of their share being used. Below Bonneville's, below Priest Rapids Dam, so that's PRD, Priest Rapids Dam, 87% is used. Above is 69%. However, to note that 69% for fisheries above Priest Rapids, they have a full season still available and ongoing. Moving forward to the fall fisheries for tules and brights, in both cases for commercial and sport, greater than 90% are used for both brights and tules. So in essence, a high proportion of allocated catch are used by all fisheries. So moving forward into the alternative gear section of the report, the points here. Have gill nets been phased out? Did alternative gear testing occur? What's the performance look like for alternative gear? And has alternative gear been implemented? So the first strategy on phasing out gill nets has mostly occurred within the Washington policy as prescribed. So that means both spring and summer have been phased out since 2017, but fall has been extended, so they have not been phased out. Moving on to the alternative gear testing, there has been quite a workload conducted by staff in primarily focusing on beach and purse seine testing, including looking at mortality rates. Ongoing, there is a pound net study going on, started in 2017 and ongoing this year in Cathlamet Channel. So moving on to the actual gear performance, there's quite a few items I'll kind of walk through briefly here, but so the first one, and this is why it pertains to kind of mixed results or mixed performance. So we've had issues with higher mortality rate on salmon like Chinook and coho in the seines than you would anticipate, making it challenging to implement catch needs due to ESA impacts. Steelhead, handle, shad, and sockeye can be quite high in primarily small mesh like the seine gear. And then overarching, the biggest challenge has just been the sheer high handle of steelhead in some areas. Even though there's a low mortality rate associated with it, the numbers add up. And in a sense, you would use up your steelhead impacts quicker using those fisheries and have a less Chinook value take home for the commercial sector than the gill nets. So just to reiterate that, that's mostly due to a high number of encounters of steelhead, not the actual mortality rate associated with steelhead. And then a couple other points, switching over to purse seines, for example, or pound net do involve a high investment cost to get going. For purse seines, it's a slightly different business structure. You need a crew rather than individual fishermen. So those are additional challenges. And the last item, talking about coho tangle nets, they do work. Their mortality rate is pretty fair. They don't occur every year. They need a high volume of fish to be successful. So that's the challenge with coho tangle nets. So moving forward into implementation, Washington does have statute to allow new gear to be phased in and tested through our RCW emerging fisheries statute. There's been very few alternative gears put in place, beach seine and purse seines in particular. They're occurring during the fall fisheries. There have been ongoing during certain years coho tangle net fisheries as well. So there have been low levels of alternative gear being put in place. I guess to note, the purse seine and beach seine fisheries that were put in place were limited entry, so that limited participation potentially, or the other aspect on that is the investment cost may have hindered full participation. So the other note here I also have is spring Chinook tangle nets were successfully developed and have been used since 2003, but through the Washington policy are no longer available as of 2017 in the main stem. So take-home message here is alternative gear implementation did not occur as you would have expected with the development of the policy. So I'm moving into the last theme, so economics, kind of your the take-home big message here. So these are the expectations in the sense from the work group to allow the policy to succeed. You would want to have the sport fishery increase opportunity in angler trips and days of fishing, enhance safe areas for commercial fishing, and implement the alternative gear. All these would have to occur in order to enhance economics of both sport and commercial fisheries. One aspect that was a challenge in analyzing and evaluating this aspect of the policy review was the effect of run size. So that's just to make sure you're aware that it is an effect that does directly impact the economic value for both commercial and recreational fisheries. So just here we have upriver spring Chinook. The actual run size during the 5-year was approximately 192,000 upriver spring Chinook. Through the work group development, it was expected we'd have 225,000 fish returning. To know, angler trips are highly correlated with the upriver run size for spring Chinook. And fall Chinook, the actual run size, as you may remember, was quite a bit larger than we would have expected, more than 2 times greater. The average run size during the policy was nearly 970,000 fish, compared to an expected of 475,000 coming back. This helps explain why ex-vessel value on the main stem were high for fall Chinook, just large numbers to catch, and the average price per pound held high for this fishery. Also to note, I don't have a graph on summer Chinook, but it was slightly above expected, but pretty close to what was expected by the work group. So moving on into the economics report card. Recreational fisheries under enhancements did see an increase in days and open and angler trips. However, they were marginal, but they're also primarily due to the large fall run sizes, of which I mentioned more than 2 times greater return on average. Ex-vessel value in the commercial fisheries were negative in 4 of the 5 years of this policy review. When the run size and price per pound were adjusted, the difference between what was expected and what actually occurred were negative. And then within SAFE, SAFE did increase, primarily in Oregon. Production did increase as well, and on the Washington side, did not succeed there. And all in all, the increase in SAFE did not make up for the loss of main stem gillnet fishing opportunities. And then the last point there, alternative gear fisheries occurred much less than anticipated, mostly due, as I mentioned, to the disproportionate steelhead usage for ESA impacts, among the other limitations I talked about. So kind of coming back to safe areas, as I mentioned, they did expand in Oregon. We looked at Cathlamet and did not succeed. Washington side, we do not have any new areas, though Oregon did explore, and Coal Creek is on that list to explore. We do have our water quality challenges, high temperatures in the summer with that, and, which is attributed in the low DO to survival. So when we've been test fishing, like for spring Chinook and Cathlamet, fish just don't survive. We only catch a handful of fish each year on that test fishery. Also, to mention, we looked at participation of Washington fishers in the Oregon safe areas, and they're relatively low at 16%. And from what we've heard, those are primarily due to decreased cost effectiveness. So basically, ability to make a profit to go into Oregon safe areas, and also heard that there perhaps is a lack of room to fish. And then the last item there is adaptive management, which we did employ in 2016 and 17, so revisions to the policy moving forward. So the take-home message here is the enhanced safe and alternative gear implementation use did not replace the reduced gillnet opportunities. Recreational fisheries did see an increase in days of opportunity open and angler days, but were marginal and not to the expected level that was provided in the development of the policy. So I'm moving on to kind of conclusions of the summary. This has been a very prescriptive policy, Many of the intentions of the policy were not realized or achieved. However, the take-home message here is that the expectations in the development of this policy were not met. To note, most conservation and predation work is ongoing, but outside of this policy. And with that in mind, the additional conservation benefits of this policy have been relatively low. All sectors were able to use the majority of their allocations, so the lack of success of the policy is not due to the opportunity as prescribed by the policy on shares of fish for harvest or impact. In the sense of economics primarily, alternative gear development did not find a replacement for the main stem gillnet fishery, with development still continuing today. The policy allowed gillnets to be extended in the main stem in part because alternative gear development and implementation did not find a solution yet, and that has yet to change. Additionally, the safe fisheries primarily benefited Oregon fishers. Production has increased in recent years, but did not materialize to fisheries as there have continued to be survival challenges. And the allocation shift from a commercial to recreational has only provided a slight increase to trips and catch for the sport fishery, all while still not meeting the expectations that were set in the development of this policy. So what is around the corner for us? Well, in 2 days, Bill and myself will be back in front of the Washington Commission to hopefully work on finalizing our 5-year report, as well as discuss what the next steps are and ideas we've heard from the public, as well as ideas from commissioners. And so that kind of leads us into this list. These are common themes of ideas that we heard through our 8-month public process on this policy review, as well as ideas from our commissioners. We did not provide any analysis or evaluations on these ideas, but just kind of give you a sense of what these ideas are. And I believe they're actually in your packet. And also to mention, the packet included our executive summary that comes out of our 5-year report. So we heard everything from do not change the policy, let it stay as is, to basically start over. Also negotiate concurrency with Oregon, or see how it plays out in 2019. Also moving on to allocations, we definitely heard some discussions from our East Side representatives on this sport allocation between above and below Bonneville, basically, and focused a little bit more on the Snake River. So there's been a lot of push to consider looking at ways to provide more opportunities upriver. Also, changes in sport and commercial allocation, and we also heard ideas on bringing back the spring Chinook matrix. There's been ideas on continuing to pursue logbooks for the guide industry. Consider making barbless hooks voluntary. Make the commercial license buyback path continue forth, and provide funding and allow it to succeed and make sure it occurs. Also hire an expert to assist with alternative gear development and implementation. Allow for spring Chinook tangle nets within the Washington policy. Continue, this kind of comes back to where we are at the first point of allow the policy to play out, so continue the ban of commercial or gill nets within the main stem fall fish, within the main stem, or end that gill net ban. Also consider the economic value to smaller communities. And so what that also means, coastal communities that have depended for years on commercial industry down there. The dollar can go pretty far, as well as we've also heard the same argument for our upriver constituents around the Snake River, that a dollar can travel further in a local, smaller community than it can in Portland, for example, and Vancouver. Also continue work on safe area enhancement in Washington and include the commercial industry in those developments. And lastly, have more interface with conservation efforts, primarily focusing on working with our recovery boards. If you have some extra time on hand to review. But again, that's why we provide you the executive summary, so you can kind of get the gist of what we learned over the last 8 months on how the policy played out over the last 5 years. Bill, is there anything else you'd like to add? So I'll move forward on to the next aspect of the presentation.
Unless commissioners have questions at this point.
And I'll open that up for any discussion at this point. I have a question. Yes.
I was trying to follow in your presentation the pound nets, and I guess I missed the overall conclusion, or whether there was success, limited success, or failure.
So far, we're still in the middle of evaluating, so we're not ready to tell you whether it's either success or failure. From a conservation perspective, the initial results are promising, but we're still waiting for final peer review on the calculated release rates and all that. But the draft release rates, the mortality rates look good as well. This fall, we conducted, based on those preliminary promising results, we went ahead and conducted an economic evaluation of the gear this fall during the fall Chinook and coho fishery. And again, numbers are just starting to come in right now. What we were hearing on the spot was that just from the condition of the fish, the buyer that we were working with was able to market them into a fairly high price niche. Because the fish are in very good condition, very desirable on the market. What we don't know yet is whether there was sufficient volume to go with that sort of promising pricing structure. And then the coho return was so poor, we essentially couldn't really evaluate economic viability in terms of the coho fishery. So stay tuned.
Okay, thank you.
Chair
Stay tuned.
Okay, thank you.
Chair Finley, if I may.
Yes.
We've been involved also with the Pound Network, not as intensely as the Washington group, but certainly we've provided some financial report and been engaged with both the commercial fishermen and the Wild Fish Conservancy, I believe, who's operating it. And I would say that the Pound Net is a mix of things that look great and things that are challenging. It is a pretty large infrastructure to put into place, 40-plus piles, so lots of permitting and other costs associated with hanging that. On the flip side, it catches fish, and the fish that it releases seem to be in very good shape, but still, I mean, as we know from all of the all-gear work that we've conducted, there are two pieces, right? Can it catch fish, and can it release those fish that are not the target fish safely? And so that piece is still outstanding, and really before you can settle on economic feasibility, you have to bring that whole package home.
Does it look the way the pilings and set that there's durability, that they're not at risk, that there's a long-term period to amortize the cost versus the benefit?
Yes, the existing pilings have been in place for at least 5 years now, and they've held up well. So,
thank you.
Just remind everybody, when you do ask a question, please use your mics. I was informed. Commissioner Thornburn, you had a question?
Yeah, Bill, on the mortality that you mentioned with the pound net, my recollection when Wild Fish Conservancy presented to us, they had done immediate mortality studies, and there was some talk about doing later mortality in the next year. Have those been distinguished or looked at?
Sorry, I'll give two answers. First off is there is always a very positive and strong correlation between immediate and long term. So even though you can't always necessarily generate the number for long term off of immediate, if you get a very good immediate, we can predict also a very good long term. Yes, we are currently cooperating with Wild Fish Conservancy and the commercial fishermen to try to find additional funding for some additional testing, focused more on the spring than the summer, fall. But yeah, there are plans to continue to try to test, and if we can get the funding, do both long-term and immediate.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you address what I would consider a value-added component as it relates to the harvested fish in the pound net because of the ability for the fishermen to bleed and gut and high grade those fish? How much by percentage it increases the marketability of those fish? And has there been any, the second part is the question, has there been any discussions with the commercial industry about co-op ventures into the future if the pound net opportunity appears to be viable?
Thank you, Commissioner. On your latter question about discussion about co-ops, no, we've not had any formal discussion at all. We've certainly all had some ad hoc hallway discussions, but the department has not undertaken anything formal, and I think on either side of the river about that. In terms of the marketability, at this point, everything we have is still sort of informal assessment. We don't have a rigorous assessment of that yet, but certainly the indications from the buyer we were working with is that indeed these fish have the potential, because of the different handling, these fish have the potential for at least some portion of the total catch to go into a higher market value category. Sort of similar to what it looks like it's sort of similar to what in Washington State, the reef nets were able to do quite a few years ago, and they've been able to maintain their price differential. So it does stand to reason that the observations we're getting off the pound net may well turn out to be similar to that sort of price boost or that market boost that reef net fish get.
If I may, I'm not trying to add to your workload, but if we could in 2018 do a comprehensive analysis of that, the value-added component on quality fish like that has some significant opportunities. I'd like to know more about it probably end of this season.
You won't be adding to our workload. That is already part of what we...
I'm sorry, I got it right.
We do intend to address that.
Thank you.
Commissioner Woolley?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So you mentioned the cost of alternative gear as a barrier to successful implementation, and we have some of the same challenges in Oregon. We did legislate a fund for the commercial fishing businesses. It kind of operates sort of like a grant-making fund, and so I was wondering if Washington had a similar program for your commercial anglers.
We don't have a program that's comparable. In past legislative sessions, the legislature has provided funds, and we don't have it at present, but much of the development work we've done has been through sort of specifically targeted funding from the Washington legislature in past years in order to promote development of these, but there isn't a fund comparable to the Oregon fund.
And another quick question, if I may. And I know you've been intending to regulate the guide industry logbooks, and I know that's on in your policy. I'm just wondering what the challenges have been to get that going.
Part of the challenge has been, for us, has been just a sequencing. At least from the Washington perspective, this isn't something that we view as just a Columbia River problem. We've been discussing this with the guide industry statewide, and so we're beginning to take those steps more on a statewide basis, but that's been part of it. It's just been scaling it up to statewide. And then the other part that we still need to put some thought into is in the lower Columbia, for us, it's not just guides, but actually under Washington rules, only charter boats may operate below the Longview Bridge, and then guides upstream of the Longview Bridge. So whatever we work out in the Columbia will need to be something that's workable for both charter operations as well as guide operations.
Thank you.
Mr. Grable?
Again, on the topic of alternative gears, I believe on your alternative gear report card page, there is a purse seiner shown there, and I believe that's the Colville Tribal purse seine. which is a very small boat that has very high success with extremely low mortalities. I believe, Bill, you've told me that the testing that was done on the Lower Columbia was done by similar boats. I'd like to see that supported. I'm not convinced that we couldn't operate boats like that for PHOS relief, particularly with Thule's. And I also am curious to know if, you know, the pound net that we're observing as operating now is quite substantial, and I'm wondering if a scaled down version or a similar version couldn't be positioned near the hatcheries where we have these extreme PHOS problems to find relief through that effort. That's just an open question that we can follow up on later.
Commissioner McKay?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On slide 16, under economics, you talk about the expectations that were to occur at the onset of the policy, and for the recreational fishery, that there was an expectation that due to reallocation, there would be increased angler trips and days on the water. And then a little bit later in the report, after you've taken into account smaller run sizes, which might have driven angler trips down, and larger run sizes, which may have driven angler trips up, regardless of the policy, that you give a yellow to increased angler trips, and you say that recreational fisheries have only seen marginal benefits in terms of, I presume, angler trips. So two questions. One is, did you do any chi-square or statistical testing to determine whether these marginal increases are statistically significant from zero? And what was expected at the onset in terms of an increase in angler trips or angler days? Was it a substantial increase, or was it only expected to be marginal?
While Ryan is looking up the answer to the latter, no, we didn't do any actual chi-square tests on that, but it's pretty obvious to us, given the fairly large amount of variability within that limited 5-year data set, that nothing would have been significant at either the 90 or 95% level.
And Mr. Chairman, I don't want to delay the meeting.
Okay.
If we're looking up for a particular number of 22 or 19 or something like that.
Commissioner Atkinson?
I had more of a broad question.
I'm sorry, we're ready.
I was wondering, when will the policy update be voted on? And I guess my interest is, because the two states are looking to try to come closer to concurrency, it seems like Oregon is also going to need to be working in that same kind of time frame.
Commissioner, on Saturday, so the second day of the Washington-only meeting here, we will be presenting the full 5-year review, including the modifications that were requested by our commissioners when they saw the 5-year review at the previous meeting. And we will be presenting it to them as a vote on whether or not to accept that as the final. Then we understand that the commission may also at that point be ready to begin to take a look at that list of potential next steps, but we're guessing that probably a full next steps discussion won't be able to occur until after our commissioners have had time to really digest that list of next steps, even though I think they've all heard many of them at previous meetings. This is the first time they've really seen the compiled list. And so as a staffer, guessing what my commission's going to do in 2 days, I would guess that they may decide to agenda that discussion on next steps for one of the next few meetings.
Okay. And so the next steps you were referring to, is that list of potential changes to
That's correct, Commissioner.
improve the policy?
That's correct.
Okay. Well, I'm eager to work with Washington as well to see if we can jointly figure out how we can improve this policy.
Commissioner Buckmaster, were you trying? Okay.
Thank you. On your page 19 economics report card, under SAFE, you mentioned that expanded areas, you gave it a yellow, said that Oregon expanded areas. Just for all of our information, maybe Oregon could address what areas were actually expanded on the select areas.
Let me, Chair Vinley, Commissioner Buckmaster, let me check and see if John has that information handy. Where's John? Anything in the very back? Certainly, we examined expanded time and area for fisheries. We definitely have expanded those opportunities in the winter. They provide small but high-value access to fish for those spring Chinook fisheries, those early fisheries. Still examining whether or not a new area is on the docket. As far as expanding boundaries, difficult to push out too far without jeopardizing the allocations that are around.
So for Washington staff's purposes, what I heard was there are no expanded areas. We have expanded some time.
Yes, also expanded into the summer, so those late spring fisheries, which have still been providing access to primarily late returning spring Chinook.
In the existing areas?
Yes,
Correct.
within the existing areas.
Okay. So there's been no expanded area in Oregon either, but we have expanded some time, which I appreciate. Okay, thank you.
Commissioner, we'll note that.
Yes, Commissioner Thornburg.
Quick follow-up question that I noticed in looking at the materials that you provided from Oregon. Related to this, I think you have a Youngs Bay Control Zone sport closure. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because isn't that related to your question, Commissioner Buckmaster?
Sure, and I'll take a shot at it, Commissioner Thorburn. So the history on the Youngs Bay closure zone, as I understand it, it predates my time here a little bit, at least in this position, but came up during the work group discussions, I believe, back in 2012. And not to get in too far into the technicalities and weeds, but Oregon's legislature, as part of, I think Commissioner Woolley had mentioned, some of the funding things that came through legislatively. During that statutory process, there was also an inclusion of the control zone there, which put some requirements on implementing it and also reviewing it after a certain period of time. And I can't remember the effective date, so I'd have to look that up. But and so that came through that. And then as we reviewed the policy a couple of times, there was discussion of whether to keep that or not, and it has remained in effect since then. It was part of the discussion point is encounters of fish destined for the Youngs Bay commercial fishery and sport fishery that transit through that specific area, and trying to, I think the intent was to try and reduce some of the catch rates in that bubble as those fish transited into the select area.
Just to kind of follow up, so the future of that, it sounds like there's a statutory issue, or what's the thinking of the commission? And
Well, Commissioner, I wouldn't speak for our commission, but the statutory link was specifically to establishing it by a date certain and with a directive to the commission to review by another date certain. The continuance or not, I believe, was left to the discretion of the commission to resolve after that point. So the statutory part, I believe, has basically served its time, and now it's a commission decision.
I see. Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Could you go to the management report card slide? I think it's slide 10. And I appreciate that it's difficult to, you know, there's a lot of information here, but there are a lot of nuances, certainly. And so, you know, I don't take this as a criticism, but it's hard to kind of put everything red, yellow, green, and so, and that leads me to my question or clarification as far as conservation is concerned. I mean, I think if you just came in off the street and you saw, wow, we're not making our conservation objectives here, but I think I heard Ryan say that that's not the case, that, you know, at least pre-policy, certainly, US v. Oregon had a lot of, and still has a lot of conservation objectives. Of course, we have ESA that we work with our friends at NOAA to make sure that we meet those objectives. So maybe comment, are we achieving those objectives outside of the policy? And then the follow-up question to that would be, what specifically are we talking about in terms of the red for conservation under the policy?
Yes, thank you, Commissioner Kehoe. So we are meeting our objectives outside the policy and conservation objectives established pre-policy, such as ESA objectives through USV Oregon. So that's probably one of the largest conservation items that we manage, you know, in season with fisheries, or meeting our ESA take on, say, Snake River Wild Fall Chinook, and, you know, or upriver spring Chinook. So year in, year out, we are meeting those objectives, sharing obviously resources with our co-managers. So the question that this pertained to, that the reason it's red, is we were focused in on PHOS analysis. So to further clarify what you asked and what you stated and what I mentioned before, is we were focusing on, did the policy through mark selective fisheries reduce hatchery fish returning to the spawning grounds? And so, yes, there's always some benefit. Obviously, we're catching hatchery fish in mark selective fisheries, so you are reducing them, but they weren't significant, especially comparing to what the weirs are able to, even challenges with weirs that operate every year with high flows and everything else in between. Those primarily hatchery fish removal was occurring through weirs and removing hatchery fish. So that's why it's a red score.
Okay. And may I, just a follow-up, just to, and then if you look at the, I just want to make sure that I'm clear on this, the gillnet phase out under the alternative gear report card, that's a yellow, and of course, and we know that, you know, it's because we modified the policy 2 years ago, actually right here in this room, or maybe down the hallway. So I just want to make sure that the gillnet, the failure to gillnet, the failure to phase out gillnets in the river is not a reflection of the failure to meet the conservation objectives or conservation. That's not why it's marked red, correct?
Correct. It's just, yeah. So the phase out was just, it's a yellow, as you stated, because gill nets were extended to date. I mean, through this year even.
Okay. And then just one last, Mr. Chair, slide 13, the travel report card. We have all green there, and there is a little asterisk provided prior to the policy. So I guess my question is would Washington and Oregon meet these objectives if this policy was not in place?
Yes, so we would meet objectives for both the Colville, Wanapum, and USV Oregon tribes, external of the policy, whether it was included or not included.
Okay. And I'm sorry, just one last follow-up. I want to follow up on Commissioner McIsaac, then I'm done, I promise. Commissioner McIsaac, I thought, brought up a good point as far as statistical significance in terms of improvement or increase in recreational angler trips. I would pose the same question with respect to the PHOS, you know, small reduction in PHOS. Was there any look to see analysis whether that small reduction was statistically significant? Now I'm done.
We can't disentangle the amount of the reduction that was due to alternative gear from the amount of reduction that was due to the installation and use of the weirs. Overall, though, the reduction itself, even though, again, we didn't test for significance, it was present every year. There was a clear reduction every year and reasonably consistent numbers. So it's always hard to get statistical significance out of 5 years, but it was a clear and consistent result. But as best we can determine just from the numbers themselves, just the raw numbers that went into it, the vast majority of that was due to the weirs. And let me just add to that, but staff are very aware that if we're going to achieve our goals for reducing PHAS, we can't rely just on weirs. I think Ryan made that clear, that over these 5 years, the weirs worked well, but we know they're not going to work well every year in all situations, in all rivers. And so a multi-tool approach to managing PHAS over the long term, to successfully managing PHAS over the long term is essential. And we get that the ability to use fisheries, both recreational and commercial, to remove large numbers of hatchery fish is going to be a very important part of a long-term successful program to manage the proportion of hatchery strays. So don't read into this that we feel like we've got success just because the weirs worked pretty well over the 5 years that we reviewed. That's exactly what we're saying, yes.
Commissioner Carpenter, McIsaac, and then Commissioner Buckmaster.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This relates to, as a follow-up to Bob, he's going to let me get a question in now, but as it relates to the conservation piece, you know, it looks like on many of the runs in the Columbia River, everything is cyclical. We had big peaks, and now the peaks are reducing over some years going forward. I've been reading quite a bit lately, and I'm not expecting an answer today on this. Maybe you want to actually think about it, but I've been reading quite a bit lately about what's expected as it relates to some level of El Nino that's involved in our coastal habitats upcoming, and there's also another blob that's forming, and it's worrisome. It's very, very worrisome as we go forward. Maybe you want to think about it and give us this afternoon, if possible, some type of a strategic plan that might be able to evolve into some type of a strategy going forward.
Commissioner, I think staffs are planning on huddling up over lunch, and we'll see if we can provide you some with preliminary thoughts on how we might approach that later on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is not a question for staff, but a response or a follow-up from Commissioner Atkinson's question about, well, where do we go from here? I'd been hoping that after we hear the full staff presentation, that there might be a lengthy discussion here at the front table about what do we do about concurrency in 2019 in particular, but maybe in the long run as well. And I am not anticipating that we would have any discussion of particular ideas, but rather just the process. And I presume that we would need to get ideally to some concurrency for 2019 early in the year. The North of Falcon process starts up pretty early, and so the discussion around this table for me might be, what can we do to try to jointly get together early in the year for a thorough discussion of concurrency that does get into some ideas, not today, but later. And then what about a process for the longer term? But I've been holding back and looking forward to that discussion after the staff presentation.
Thank you, Chair. I don't think my comment is really that important to those of us who've been involved in this issue for a long, long time, some from the beginning. But I think it is important for the general public. I notice we have some reporters in the audience, and so I think words do matter. On page 7, on your background, you say designed to establish recreational priority for salmon and steelhead in the mainstream Columbia River. For somebody who wasn't aware of pre-plan allocations, that would indicate there wasn't a recreational priority before this plan. It would also suggest that somehow there was a steelhead, some sort of priority, or I think equal between commercial and sports, where we know it's always been recreational on steelhead, at least in the last several years. So for purposes of just clarity moving forward, it seems like this was a plan that was designed to increase the recreational priority. And I don't think it changes your color coding at all, but it certainly changes where we started from. And I think it might be more informative to those casual readers of what we produce, what you produce. Thanks.
I had a question about the PHOS. During which season is the PHOS of greatest concern?
Throughout the basin, it is a concern for most runs. This policy focused on the use of fisheries to help achieve PHOS objectives for Lower Columbia Fall Chinook, ESA listed Lower Columbia Fall Chinook, and ESA listed Columbia River Coho. Do you want to add anything to that? Okay.
Okay, and so that's primarily because we're not able to harvest all of those hatchery fish?
There's a balance. So both National Marine Fisheries Service and on the Washington side, the Lower Columbia Salmon Recovery Board, and I can't speak to on the Oregon side, but they've all those entities have identified large numbers of hatchery origin, both Chinook and Coho, on the spawning grounds as one of the primary threats, one of the primary problems to achieving our recovery objectives for those fish. And to go back to basics, there's two ways of addressing that. One is reducing hatchery production, or the other is more efficiently and effectively removing the hatchery fish on return. The reason that both the agencies and recovery boards and others have been reluctant to take reducing hatchery fish as the only tool is because of the importance of those hatchery fish both to ocean fisheries, really for both states, as well as to in-river fisheries. And so the attempt has been to really balance hatchery production with the appropriate range of harvest tools as well as weirs in order to achieve those objectives. And that's what we're still working towards, is finding that right balance and finding the tools to actually successfully and consistently achieve that balance.
Okay. And so what happens to the excess hatchery fish that are at the weirs?
I don't know. Yeah. On the Washington side, there's most of them, because the weirs are located fairly near the hatcheries and upstream of most of the fisheries except some of the tributary recreational fishing. Most of them are simply removed for surplus. There may be other uses at times, such as carcass supplementation, but I think the bulk of them are simply removed and surplused.
And what does surplus mean?
Sent out for, hopefully, for some amount of commercial sale in order to simply remove the fish from the watershed. So usually bought by a buyer, and they essentially then go into low grade, at that point, low grade salmon usage. But again, where we work out alternative arrangements where we can to get the highest and best use, but it's always a challenge for us.
Okay, thanks.
We ready to continue on? Yes.
Brian, you raised an issue we haven't, or I haven't heard much about as we've gone through this process, and that is, I think you said that at least in Washington, there was a limited entry system for tangle nets and seines. What I'm wondering is possibly a bit more general than that. Are Washington and Oregon in concurrence with respect to, speaking from the commercial side, who can buy licenses and who can't?
That's going to require both states to answer. Chris, if you want to start.
If I could ask a clarifying question, are you asking, does Oregon have limited entry on commercial permits as well?
Correct.
Yes, yes, we do.
One of the factors that's been sort of stymieing buyback, though, is because each state does license separately, and because even when there's limited entry, there's still often licenses for sale. Trying to ensure that joint goals such as the license buyback program can be met, or joint limited entry goals can be met, requires a degree of coordination that isn't currently available to us legally, but certainly could be designed, but hasn't been necessary yet, but will be, I think, necessary if we're to achieve those goals.
Also, Commissioner Baker, one more clarifier. So while the licenses in general are limited entry, the tangle net fisheries, once you have a license, are not limited entry. The seine fishery in that experimental way was additionally limited entry from the pool of license holders. Those fisheries were implemented under research impacts, so we had a limited amount of ability to fish there and could not turn that open to all commercial license holders at that time. So that was, I guess, limited entry within the limited entry.
Commissioner Graybill, why don't you wind this part up, then we'll take a 10-minute break and then continue on with the presentation.
All right, just briefly, I wanted to point out on the conservation scorecard, the way I read it, and with closer reading of the review, I think it would be fair to say that one of the reasons that this scorecard is low on conservation is because of US v. Oregon, we were meeting conservation goals. And unless there was real significant improvement due to the policy, it would be difficult to move the bar. Closely reading the review, you will see that it is mentioned that there was conservation benefits in the spring run. And I believe one other, maybe it had been in the fall, I don't have that in front of me, Ryan, but I think you recall that. So there was benefit, and it would have to have been very significant to move this into a yellow or green area due to already imposed very strict ESA benefits from US v. Oregon. So I think that's fair to say. And another just brief comment is that under new mark selective fisheries, no, we weren't able to expand safe areas. So we weren't in the lower Columbia River Basin able to make much progress during this period, exact period. However, I did want to mention in the upper Columbia, in the region that I live in, we had several, just within Region 2, at least 4, probably as high as 6, additional mark selective fisheries that became available during this policy period due to escapement. So I just wanted to make that mention, and then I'm done.
Thank you. I think we'll, with that point, take a 10-minute break and then continue on with the presentation. So it's 10:27, so 10 minutes from now.
Oh, I just heard that. It's getting scarier and scarier.
They might just take Be curious to see what. Just don't call me Frank. No, I won't. Around the office. I won't. Really, how are you doing? I'm good. I'm better now. I was really worried you guys are going to make me sit there for 4 hours without taking a bathroom break. I'm like, I better slow down on the coffee. I'm fueled by coffee, so I'm like, I gotta keep going. I can't slow down or I'm when we come, I will. Coming up.
Find some hot water.
Could come back to order, please. We won't start without you, Bill. But now we'll start with you there. So please continue, gentlemen.
Chairs Smith and Finley, members of both commissions. Again, my name is Tucker Jones, Ocean Salmon Columbia River Program Manager for Oregon Fish and Wildlife. I'm going to walk us through a little bit of where we are regarding concurrency. I believe you guys actually have this. It sort of breaks down a little bit small on the screen, so if you want to work through your own handouts, that might be best. I guess a little housekeeping road mapping for these slides. spring, summer, fall, look at coho. Those issues where states are sort of not in alignment are bolded within the matrix. So just, I guess, as a way to orient yourself. Thinking with regards to spring, really, I think more in common than not within spring Chinook management between the two states. Allocations are similar. Chinook management between the two states. Allocations are similar. No pre-update buffer applied to the commercial off-channel fisheries. Where we differ is sort of what can occur in the main stem post-run update. The Oregon policy allows stem post-run update. The Oregon policy allows post-run update for tangle nets to be used in the main stem to access any unused commercial allocation. And at that point, so those are things that would not happen typically very often, but would probably occur only on an increasing run update. So if you forecast a certain number and then the return at the update is more, then you would potentially have a chance to access those through tangle nets in the main stem according to the Oregon policy. The Washington policy as it currently stands does not allow that. So, we're concurrent on allocation, we're concurrent on the buffer. We're not concurrent on whether or not there could be main stem commercial fishing, post-run update. And then again, I guess on the Oregon side, there is a provision that unused commercial impacts are left for escapement, and the Washington policy does not speak to that, from my understanding. Moving to summer, again, largely concurrent with regards to summer fisheries management. We are definitely concurrent on allocation, 80-20 sport and commercial. No gear net gears allowed in the main stem. There is the option available in both states for commercial main stem fisheries, but without a gill net provision. The difference in the summer between the two states is what is to be done with any unused commercial allocation, and they're sort of partially different here. The Oregon policy states that any unused commercial impacts, or not impacts, I guess, unused portions of the harvest allocation, because they're not listed in the summer, are to be left for escapement and conservation. And in Washington, that is a potential option, but they can also be transferred to upriver sport fisheries. Fall is a little messier, I guess, with regards to concurrence between the two states. Right now, Oregon has and that's, I guess, partially due to the fact that fall is just messier from a fisheries management standpoint with multiple constraining stocks in the river at the same time. And so the splits in Oregon on allocation are basically less than or equal to 70% for sports of the most constraining stock as forecasted in the preseason, and greater than or equal to 30 for commercial. Washington, those splits for 17 and 18 are 75-25, and then moving forward would be 80-20. In the Oregon policy, gill nets are allowed in commercial zones 4 and 5, which is, I mean, I'm sure you all know, but upstream of the Lewis River Warrior Rock line up to Bonneville Dam. That is the same for Washington 2017 and 18, but as currently written would be phased out moving forward. And then the Oregon policy also allows up to 2% of the commercial allocation to be available to alternative gears in the lower river for those sort of PHOS reduction type fisheries. So concurrent, I guess, on gears currently, but not necessarily on allocations within the last couple of years. And then moving forward, not concurrent on either allocations or gears to be used in the main stem. Coho, everything is concurrent. Non-gill nets in the main stem, tangle net fisheries only. Assign the commercials a sufficient share of the impact to implement both off-channel and these tangled net fisheries. Same in Washington, everything is concurrent here. The trouble here is that there's been, it's been difficult to access these fisheries in the last couple of years. So moving into the concurrency summary, sort of trying to step through this relatively quickly. I guess to start with, there's nothing about, co-management or concurrency or the compact process that impinges upon state sovereignty. Concurrency promotes orderly, enforceable fisheries. It increases the likelihoods of allocations being achieved, but it's not required, and each state can do what they need to. That being said, not having concurrent regulations is a real tough situation from a management standpoint. It's going to impact fisheries pretty substantially, both recreational and commercial fisheries. Certainly a higher impact for boat-based fisheries. Anything land-based would just be following the sort of, as it does now, I guess, the regulations of the bank you're standing on, but would have a pretty high impact on those boat fisheries. And will make it very, very difficult. I mean, the border is pretty well set on a map, right? But the map is harder to find when you're on a boat on the water and things move. So that will make it difficult for us to manage. It will make it difficult for law enforcement to enforce. It will make it difficult for our customers, the anglers and commercial fishermen, to figure out what they're going to be doing and how they're going to be doing it in a way that fits within the bounds of what they want to do. So not really a place that I personally want to be. And then I guess I just want to touch briefly on the fact that, so these are sort of broad overarching concerns about concurrency, but the states and the staffs on sort of the minor nuts and bolts things, we already work together periodically to try to chew up things and work together. And in fact, we're working on sort of a reg simplification process right now. We've met a couple of times and are talking about sort of chewing up the small things. It's these sort of larger overarching issues that are more troublesome. So next slide, Brad, thanks. Briefly talk about thermal sanctuaries and thermal concurrency. I don't know how much this is on the Washington Commission's radar, given that I haven't come to a Washington Commission meeting in a while, or ever. So.
You're invited.
Well, thank you.
You can look at the materials on the website.
Yeah.
Bill will sign it.
Yeah, there you go. I appreciate that. This is an emerging issue. I think everybody is aware of climate change and how that's impacting our world. It was really thrust to the forefront of our world in 2015 with really hot weather, low precipitation, really just uncomfortable river conditions for fish coming back and for fish leaving. And the states took some actions then in response to that. And then sort of not too long after that, in 17, and again this last year, we've had really sort of low returns of steelhead, summer steelhead destined for interior basins, Snake River especially. And we took a lot of management actions to sort of reduce the impact of fisheries on those summer steelhead. Those were not primarily, looking at these sort of thermal sanctuaries. I guess also concurrent to this, the EPA has begun looking and examining the importance of cold water refuge areas throughout the Columbia River. And so that's an alternative process going on, and I'll speak a little bit more to that next slide, but I just also want to say, without going into too much on it because I'm not that intimately familiar, that there's been some recent litigation and a decision in the federal courts with regards to the temperature TMDL in the Columbia River system, and that's going to throw another wrinkle into this whole process. So, next slide, please. So as I said, the EPA has been working on identifying both areas and use of these areas by fish migrating through the Columbia River corridor. This is an ongoing process. Originally, they thought they were going to have a draft report out late summer, early fall, around the end of August or September. It's my understanding that they now expect that draft report out in December or early January. Again, hard to know how the recent litigation may throw a wrinkle into that. We have sort of committed within Oregon with working with the EPA and the public in sort of identifying these areas and examining situations. So examining boundaries that could work to try to protect these areas during those migration corridors, but also in situations when you might want to employ them both temperature-wise and run size-wise. It's a pretty complicated thing to try to actually figure out. The focus for this thermal sanctuary work that we've been engaged on is primarily upstream of Bonneville Dam. To really have an effective area, you need to have temperature differentiation, so if the temperature's not enough different, right, so you need to have a cold water input and a warm water out thing to really sort of attract the fish. And most of those seem to be upstream of Bonneville. There are lots of other places downstream. The differentials are not as much, but there are 13, I think, identified primary cold water refuge areas by the EPA, and I think 7 of those are on the North Shore and 6 are on the south. And we're working, or we'll work once the EPA gets that draft report out, to put boundaries on those and then talk with our public about, do these boundaries make sense? How do they look? Do they make sense biologically? Do they make sense from a fisheries management standpoint? Do they make sense from an enforcement standpoint? We did do a little bit of that work this summer, putting in a thermal sanctuary area around the mouth of the Deschutes. It was tricky from a management standpoint to try to find that right balance of biologically meaningful management-wise, recognizable by the angling community and enforceable by law enforcement. I think we were sort of narrowing in on that in an adaptive management sort of way, but I think when we were finally getting that dialed in, we sort of realized that the steelhead run was not materializing as we expected, and we basically quit fishing on that, which sort of negated the need really for the thermal sanctuaries in the fall. And at the same time, temperature differentials also came down to the point where we weren't really looking at enough of a difference between the river and the main stem to have that same effect. So again, we're going to be working through this, and we have been in conversations with Washington staff as we go. I know they are also, I think, at least professionally curious, and also, if you know, I don't like to put words in the mouths of my counterparts, but I know they're engaged and think that this has a potential importance as well.
Tucker, thank you very much. You know, this came to our attention last year. I appreciated the action that Oregon took off the mouth of the Deschutes. And we closed Drano Lake, maybe, I think, for the same concerns, particularly for the steelhead, although that does get some mixed stocks, and we're going to talk about that later in our meetings as well. How far upstream did the investigation occur in terms of looking for these sanctuaries?
So the Deschutes is about as far upstream as you can get and still have that cold water differential. Those sort of inputs further upstream, John Day, Umatilla on the Oregon side, Yakima, what's the Rock Creek, I think, they're not cold enough, right, to provide the differential between there to attract the fish. The other thing I think that's important to think about with these thermal sanctuary areas is that they can be important and useful for steelhead because of steelhead's life history, right? They have a longer clock. For sockeye, summer chinook, and fall chinook, these are largely hospice areas, and if those fish go there, they will probably wind up dying before they reach their interior basin. So.
Let me just add a little bit to Tucker's final point there, because I think that's a very good point and worth remembering. And that goes back then to the issue of whether or not EPA, and then I guess in cooperation with the states, is actually going to do a TMDL for temperature throughout the Columbia system. And that will get at, so for instance, that gigantic loss of sockeye that we had in 2015, that had little or nothing to do with the availability of thermal refugia in certain spots. It had everything to do with the ambient water temperatures as they move through the system. And so it's keeping both of those in mind. As Tucker mentioned at the beginning, it sort of, the recent decision on TMDL is another sort of complicating factor in a way, but simply from the perspective of trying to understand thermal refugia and trying to think of them as a management tool, it is a complicating factor. Ultimately, over time, I think, and this is probably where Tucker was going with this, that being able to address both ambient temperatures throughout the main stem as well as thermal refugia is probably going to give us the biggest sort of bang for fish protection in general.
Yeah. And one of the wrinkles I meant by the recent litigation is that I don't know what that will do within the EPA with regards to their staff and their work on this area.
Yeah, neither do we, and it strains our resources as well, but
Yes, Commissioner McIsaac.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A question on the EPA study. So analyzing the effects of a closure can be a complicated manner, as you've indicated, and it would be comforting to know that the kind of sophistication in fishery management analysis that's at the table here and each agency is involved in that. If an area, say off the mouth of the Deschutes, is closed, obviously then anglers will not be there. There'll be fewer steelhead hooked and released in that refugia area, but there'll be greater effort outside, and some of the fish that are saved from inside will be hooked and released outside at different water temperatures that are higher. And so it all gets very complicated and does require some level of sophistication to come up with an answer of whether or not these refugia result in more steelhead on the spawning grounds than if the refugia was not in place. So it would be disappointing if the EPA report came out and just said cold water is good for fish and didn't get into whether or not the refugia as a protection, as a fishery management tool, actually does accomplish something significant. So my question is, are you all involved in the EPA study, and can you bring that, your expertise and sophistication, to that forum?
Chair Smith, Commissioner McIsaac. Involved in that we are working and engaged with them, but not involved. They've been actually not real inviting into sort of their modeling workshops or any piece like that. And I expect that their study is going to be probably slightly more than cold water is important to fish. It will be identifying the areas where they are and is there enough cold water area for the fish that are migrating through the system. I'm going to go ahead and pretend I heard another question in there and answer it anyways. With regards to the management aspects of that and recognizing a difference in if you can model out the effort shifts and the catch differences that will occur there, I think those are really difficult questions, and it's going to be very hard to, I think, discern whether or not these are actually resulting in an increase of fish on spawning grounds. But you know, it is a increasingly hostile climatic environment for fish moving through the system, and sort of applying the precautionary approach is what we would be doing here. So you're not necessarily sure the magnitude of the benefit that you're applying, but that you're trying to err on the side of the fish and the resource.
Tucker, do you know what office within EPA is tasked with this?
know which offices, actually. I know that my contacts, I know who my contacts there are, but I can look into finding that out.
Thank you.
If I could add, they do have a website that discusses quite a bit of their process, so I think that would be pretty easily accessible as well.
Other, were you done? Okay, yes. Okay, Commissioner Atkinson, yes.
I have some questions about the thermal sanctuary information. In looking at this EPA map, and I know this is still the draft phase, but why is Oregon interested in only focusing above Bonneville Dam? It seems like there are some important refugia potentials below Bonneville Dam, in particular the Sandy River.
Largely a focus of where we think the impact would be the most effective, Commissioner Atkinson.
So even though we have a fall fishery in the lower river on Chinook, and the lower river is even hotter than the upper river, why not?
There is certainly I think, a larger effort focus within these areas upstream of the dam. Downstream effort is spread out a little bit more. I mean, it can also bunch up around the mouth, but it's not nearly as concentrated as it is upstream.
So do you have fisheries information about the use of these potential thermal refugia at those river tributaries?
More anecdotal, we've just recently started applying our creel methods upstream of Bonneville Dam.
And I'll briefly add to that, one thing that's very different below Bonneville from upstream is the effect of the tidal wedge, and that's typically pretty cool water. And you know, the fish are getting once or twice a day. The fish can always find downstream of the cowlitz, really, and upstream of the cowlitz can often find several times a day. And trying to sort that out from everything else and from when fish are more and less catchable relative to both the tidal cycle and all that it's a much more complicated situation for us to try to figure out whether there's a role there. And we just have not seen the kinds of mortalities or losses below Bonneville, and again, probably in part due to the presence of the tidal wedge that we've seen upstream. It's upstream where we've got clear evidence of thermal problems, both in terms of refugia, but equally in terms of the ambient temperatures. We weren't seeing sockeye mortalities, for instance, until well upstream of Bonneville in 2015.
And Chair Finley and Commissioner Higginson, that's not to say that they're off the table. They're just not the focus.
Yeah.
Okay. And it sounds like there is some significant information from the Idaho research that had 3,000 radio telemetered fish that were monitored on what they did and didn't do relative to using thermal refugia. So I guess we have some information from that as well, as far as location.
They tend to hopscotch their way up.
And the other question I had was, is there any reason that we need to wait for the EPA study to set up rules for the 2019 year regarding thermal refugia?
Chair Finley, Commissioner Atkinson, I think that it is, in my opinion, you can certainly take management action that we do with the best available science all the time. At this point in time, it feels like there is going to be an update to that best available science and that it is right around the corner. And I don't think that there's anything that stops us from taking management actions in 2019 if required. And I expect that this process will continue and we will move into the public thing. But as far as permanent rulemaking, I would much prefer to get that complete body of work in hand and have it to consult and look at and use, and then take those actions, than to take some actions and then have an update to the best available science and need to reopen those and readdress. I mean, you may not have to. You might not have to. We might have got it right. I am pretty awesome, so there's a chance I could get it right out of the gate. There's a chance I could get it right out of the gates, but sometimes I don't get it right, and staff, sometimes we miss a little bit, and I think when that information is on the cusp of being in our hands, it doesn't seem to make a ton of sense to make a big action on a permanent scale until we have that in hand.
Well, thank you for being really awesome, and we do appreciate that. Just wondered about a timeline for when we might be addressing that.
So, Chair Finley, Commissioner Atkinson, the original timeline involved working this fall. As you know, I talked to you guys in Baker, and that was under the assumption that the EPA was going to be handing us that report in late August, early September. I anticipate if we get that report in late December, early January, we will start moving. The timeline had months on it for meetings and talking with the public and a commission action. I think sort of it is still in place, just the months are fluid at this moment. But certainly I expect sometime within 2019, unless something dramatic with regards to the TMDL litigation changes within the EPA. Yeah.
Okay, so it could be before our 2019 hot water season that we could be implementing something?
Yes, it's definitely possible, Commissioner Atkinson.
Mr. Buckmaster.
I think you will continue to get pressure from members of the Oregon Commission to have something in place for 2019. The EPA in Portland did a workshop on this issue, and just for information, both we had members, staff from both WDFW and ODFW at that workshop. So as far as having staff involved, at least at the one I attended, we had staff from both, so I have confidence that we have staff staying abreast of the issue. I learned things at that particular workshop. I was absolutely shocked that there was not a significant thermal striation by depth in the Columbia River. I just always assumed that you were going to have a lot of cold water at the bottom of a 40 or 32-foot channel. And what was presented at that workshop said that that simply isn't true, that there's enough mixing going on that you don't have that. The length of time that the various species stay in thermal refugia, I don't think there's anybody that would argue that if you're going to hook and release a steelhead in warm water or cold water one time, it's better to do it in cold water. But what was shown at that workshop, and we've received other information, is that unlike the Chinook, steelhead can stay in some of these refugia for up to 30 days. So it's a question of multiple hookings that concerned a number of us on the Oregon Commission. We talked about having at least the beginnings of a matrix based on time, based on temperature, something that did as little as possible to inconvenience fishermen in Drano Lake for sockeye or Chinook, but to protect. I think we're at a place where we feel a very serious concern and responsibility to protect the steelhead. Based on the numbers we've seen the last few years. So like my colleague from Eastern Oregon, I think we would like to see the best we can do, a reasonable sense of a matrix approach to where and how we're going to look at refugia, knowing full well that whatever comes out of the EPA and the lawsuit may change it with additional information, but I don't think we want to miss that opportunity. Erring on the side of these steelhead runs is the right thing to do. I think our Oregon's, and I believe Washington has said the same thing. So.
Yes. In fact, we have unanimous consent, we did a sense of the commission about these refugee issues, and not just in the Columbia. I mean, we have issues in the Umpqua and other streams too. So we have asked the department to develop an overall scheme that would have criteria to allow the director to implement closures, restrictions, or other actions necessary, and we think that's important.
Commissioner McIsaac?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question goes back to concurrency, so if there's, I don't want to interrupt any theme on the cold water.
Yes.
So that we trust Tucker and Chris with your awesomeness, that you will,
Awesomeness rubs off.
you will
He's just got nailed.
put a very high scrutinizing eye on the analysis that the EPA does. And we know that you'll do that. My sense is that their conclusions and recommendations may be more conservative and less progressive and less conservation focused than ours would be. That's just my own personal opinion. And so we would hope that you would be poised to take those next steps that benefit fish and have that as the highest priority, because I think we may have a higher bar for conservation. So, you know, we look forward to you implementing that scrutiny in your work, okay? Yeah.
Yeah, Commissioner Woolley, as a former EPA person, I share your concern. Yes, Commissioner Keough.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm looking at this a little differently and wondering if staff have explored this along with NOAA. I'm very familiar with the Fraser sockeye management. I sit on the Fraser panel and have been there for a number of years now. And over my tenure, we have seen, of course, increasing temperatures in the Fraser River, and which no doubt lead to pre-spawn mortality. And so what the panel does, along with the Pacific Salmon Commission, is, you know, there's been a lot of work. It still needs to be fine-tuned, and there's some complicating factors. But in essence, what we do on the Fraser is that when we see warm temperatures above certain, 19 degrees Celsius or higher for Fraser sockeye, what we end up doing is increasing the escapement goals to compensate for pre-spawn mortality. And so it's a little different approach than the thermal sanctuary. So, but my question is, has that been explored to see if you can kind of quantify what the pre-spawn mortality loss would be associated with different range of temperatures, and then compensate for that by increasing escapement goals? I know maybe a lot of people in the room don't want to hear this, because it does, at least with respect to the Fraser, result in lower harvest. So I just put that out there, and just curious if that's been explored.
It's an excellent point, I think, Commissioner Kehoe. I'm personally not aware of any detailed study of pre-spawn mortality of steelhead associated directly with different levels of temperature. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I'm just not familiar with it. And I suspect it may not exist at that level of detail yet. I know there's lots of pit tag comparisons made for pit tagged fish as they go upstream and survival rates between dams. So there is at least some ability to assess certain kinds of interdam loss and make some estimations of total loss. You have to account for a lot of variables, but it should be at least conceptually feasible. Whether it's technically feasible, I don't know. And then the difficulty would be, is there enough variation across time in the temperature to be able to get a strong relationship between those things. So there's a couple of phases there, but I'm just not aware of it if it is done. On the non-treaty fishery side, you know, we're operating within a 2% ESA limitation, so we have some flexibility there. It's not a direct escapement goal-based process. And of course, USV Oregon would have to be a part of that harvest rate schedule, but if the data was there to support that, it would be something worth discussing. That's about the best I could do, I think.
Oh, good, thanks.
2015 was really our first year of experience with broad-scale pre-spawning mortality due to temperature outside of steelhead, where we've got some longer history, but I mean, as Chris said, we don't have that kind of fine-grained data even on steelhead. But 2015 was a wake-up call to us in terms of the effects of temperature more broadly than just the cold water refugia issue, and I think we still have to grapple with some of those. And Chris accurately described the process we would need to go through. Chair Smith, I do have one, if before we move on to other concurrency issues, I do want to make a final point about concurrency and thermal refugia, but I'm fine to hold that until you.
Maybe Commissioner Carpenter's question will then take it from there.
I was reviewing the winter almanac, if you will, forecast for our part of the world. Washington, Oregon, Montana, it's supposed to be warmer. I don't recall if it's wetter or drier. That's not relevant. In my mind, it's the warmer part that concerns me as far as snowpack, et cetera. But my question is, you folks have been working together from both states. Has there been some consideration, because of the importance of this as it relates to steelhead and other stocks, of forming a type of task force of people from both states, and perhaps some to really drill down on this and build a coalition to find a pathway forward on this as quickly as possible? And if you haven't done that, maybe I could ask you to consider that and talk to your folks in each state agency and see what they think about that.
Commissioner Carpenter, speaking more broadly for the steelhead issues in particular, or specific to thermal refuges, or sort of both together, all one? Okay, that's what I interpreted. I just wanted to clarify. Yeah, it's a good idea.
I think it's an excellent idea, and you actually did get towards part of the point I wanted to make, only you generalized it.
I'm not as good as Tucker, but I'm gaining.
He's awesome too.
Yeah, you know, I mean, I don't want to cheapen the awesome label, but I would put you in the awesome category as well.
I think it's cheapened already.
The specific point that I wanted to make that I think goes pretty directly in a lot of ways to Commissioner Carpenter's suggestion is that even when we're looking at, say, a cold water refugia that's in one state's waters of the concurrent waters, it's still a concurrent waters issue. It's still a two-state issue. If Washington's considering a cold water refugia on the Washington side of the river, but that it's still in concurrent waters, Oregon anglers need to know that. And most Oregon anglers don't go to the Washington pamphlet. They depend on the Oregon regulations to tell them what's going on throughout the concurrent waters, and similarly on the Washington side. And so even though, yes, it's quite possible for one state to act sort of unilaterally in order to protect a cold water refugia in response to a certain set of circumstances, it's very difficult for the other state to not also react in order to make sure that anglers are fully informed of any changes that happen anywhere within concurrent areas. So it's never just a one state. So the solution that Commissioner Carpenter just suggested is actually probably a really good way of making sure we're both moving together at every point, and that's what's going to serve anglers the best, as well as meet conservation objectives the best.
Did you have further points that you wanted to? Okay.
No, sir.
So we can go to other questions. Have you wrapped up your? Right? Okay. So then we'll just open it up for other questions. And I believe Commissioner McIsaac, you had a question.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. With regard to concurrency on your slide 27, You made note of the fact that in Washington State, there was an adaptive management response that changed the situation on Zone 4 and 5 gillnet fisheries. The Commission, at least on one other occasion in Washington, has entertained the adaptive management provision for something that would be a change to the policy. My question is, I don't understand the Oregon adaptive management capabilities. I'm not aware that they have the same kind of policy document that gets into all of this detail of season by season, stock by stock, and the rest of it. But maybe I'm wrong, there is such a document. So my question is there an adaptive management feature in the Oregon analogous policy description of managing the Columbia River, and has it ever been exercised?
Commissioner McIsaac, yes. Oregon's approach is most of the policy aspects are actually written into administrative rule, including the allocations, gear requirements, and an adaptive management rule subsection within our OAR. So there is that. There's also some language in the statute that we referenced earlier that discusses adaptive management in the commission policy. So it is absolutely front and center in the commission's policy. And I would say, yes, the commission has taken adaptive management. If I reference the process we went through last year in 2017, staff made some presentations for some adaptive measures, including not implementing the long-term approach that was in place or anticipated to take effect in 2017 for fall. And so I would say that was one example of adaptive management, and there are probably others as well. But yes, long and short, I think the answer is absolutely yes on both counts.
Commissioner Baker.
I'm looking at slide 26, and just on the issue of non-concurrency, one of the lenses that at least I look at it through is that we can disagree on how we manage people and gear and that type of thing, and it's awkward and it's hard, but it can happen. But we can't disagree on how we manage fish, because fish don't listen to any of us. And so when we get to a non-concurrent issue like what we do with the unused commercial catch, which is down on 26, and it says for Oregon it's left for escapement, for Washington it's either left for escapement or transferred upstream. What happens on the ground when we have that kind of a disagreement? What if we want to go ahead and transfer the escapement upstream, and Oregon wants to just leave it for escapement?
Thanks, Commissioner. It's not an easy question, but at present, as Ryan pointed out when he talked about the upriver spring Chinook fishery, upriver summer Chinook fishery, excuse me, and their whether or not they were actually catching their full allocation. At present, they're often not. And so those fish then do accrue on through to escapement. And the reason they're not is we've got a fairly complicated set of fisheries up there to try to help achieve our PHAS goals, as in addition to just the basic spawning escapement goals. So to some extent, we crimp their style in a way that if we weren't doing that, they'd obviously catch more fish. So at the practical effect of this difference at present is nil. Because that fishery that upriver fishery isn't taking its full share now. It's getting its full opportunity, but not taking its full share now. In the future, though, if and when that fishery does begin to take its full share, then that does pose a more complicated issue that ultimately I think the two agencies, the two sets of managers would need to resolve, but it also would include the Colville tribes. They have a significant voice in what happens to the non-treaty share of summer Chinook. And so I think in essence it would end up having to be a three-way discussion to resolve that. And we've just been able to avoid that discussion because of present circumstances.
I might add just a couple of thoughts. I think Bill covered it well. In the summer case, for instance, you also have geographic differences. And so there is a point at which those fish migrate through concurrent waters and go into waters that are solely within the state of Washington. And so, you know, where Oregon's role falls in the ultimate manage of that side is a question we would have to talk about at staff level. My overarching goal is the direction my commission provides me and how they want to do that is how I'm going to try and advocate for those fisheries when they're at least within our management arena. And so that would be, you know, we would advocate at our meetings for leaving fish uncaught, at least as they left Oregon concurrent waters, as a starting point. And, it, you know, but that's based on our current guidance. And so, you know, what the two commissions tell their respective staffs comes into play in terms of guidance for how we prosecute those things and how we resolve issues. If there's specifications for a certain strong approach from one commissioner or another, that obviously is going to bear some weight. So, but it does put the staffs in an awkward place.
Further questions? Well, and if there, are you ready to proceed, or you want to wait till after lunch to start the second part?
You've received our full presentation, so unless you have more to request from us, we're ready to let somebody else occupy these seats.
Okay. Yeah, then let's have, I don't think anybody will object to an early lunch. So we will break until 1:30.
Yeah, true. But I think there's still